Well, you've had some things to say about the Trump administration's approach to Venezuela. Do you agree, though, with what seems to be a pretty broad view that at the moment Nicolas Maduro relies on military might and also that there are very questionable voting practices in past elections as well?
Well, I'm glad you raised that issue because the prevailing mythology, shall we say, does not give voice to the full story. And in fact, if you look at that 2018 election, the re-election of Maduro, it's very clear that both the UN and the EU were invited to observe. They were invited personally by the foreign minister at the United Nations. That's very clear. They declined to observe. On the other hand, there were over 100 observers from many nations, over a dozen nations around the country. This included prominent diplomatic figures, including the former premier of Spain. It included members of the press, including the Center for Investigative Journalism. So there were many reliable and compelling observers who all testified to the integrity of that election. Going back some time
when the technology,
Carter
though, didn't you?
Pardon me?
You had questions, though, even raised about the technology within that voting within the election.
You know, those were not documented. They were not documented whatsoever. There was some question raised, but it was not laid out. It was not put forward. On the other hand, the international observers who were there, who were speaking to the candidates from all parties, were very clear that there were no complaints on the part of the participants in the election, and there was no evidence of fraud. So the media, unfortunately, has been rather complicit in a drumbeat for war here. And if you look at the role of mainstream media here, it's frighteningly analogous to the role played by the media in the run-up to the war in Iraq, for example, where there's just a constant drumbeat for war. There are many stories which are patently false, which are being promoted. One of them was finally acknowledged by the New York Times just this past weekend when they acknowledged that the story about Maduro's forces setting fire to the aid trucks was absolutely false. And there was video evidence that, in fact, it had been started from the side of the opposition forces who were gathered around the trucks. So there are many falsehoods now which are being circulated while the alternative media, which is actually covering, is being locked out. So, you know, I think there's a very strong case to be made here. This is regime change, and it's not the first time. Remember, this is regime change number 68 on the part of the American empire. So we have a real problem here. It's not good for the world, and it's not good for people in the United States who are spending 60% of our discretionary budget on a very bloated and reckless military, now under the watch of the likes of Elliott Abrams and John Bolton. You know, it's a very dangerous proposition. And Donald Trump said himself very clearly that he's got his eye on Venezuela, all that oil right in our backyard. His direct quote is quoted by the former Deputy Director of the FBI, Andrew McCabe, in his book. He said clearly, Donald Trump said it's Venezuela we should be going to war with. They have that oil and they're right in our backyard. So I think it's extremely,
we are out of time.
What should we say, problematic not to be addressing the full story here.
We're right out of time there, Jill Stein, former presidential candidate. But we do appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
Great talking with you. Thanks so much, Tom.
Well, a critical incident investigation